Let's talk about the Insurrection Act, protecting fragile white men from threats to their power since 1807. Hey folks, I'm Tad Sturmer. I'm an American scholar of resistance history at the University of Southern Denmark and Johns Hopkins. In 1807, Thomas Jefferson, that champion of limited government and critic of executive power and tyranny, he signed a law giving presidents nearly unlimited authority to deploy military force against American citizens. The Insurrection Act was not passed during a national emergency. By the time Jefferson signed it on March 3, 1807, the problem that had prompted it, Aaron Burr's alleged plot to carve out his own nation in the Louisiana Territory, he was acquitted of that, was over. Burr had been arrested weeks earlier. But fragile white men will do what fragile white men always do, panic and grab for more authority. So Jefferson got what he wanted. He got a law that removed judicial oversight and gave presidents unilateral authority to decide when insurrection exists and deploy military force domestically. And that's where it is today. But here's what changed in 1807. Before 1807, think about it. Shays' Rebellion, the Great Freakout in 1787, terrified Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and others to push for a constitution to create a consolidated federal power to shut down domestic resistance to their authority, no matter how much they abused it. Then, in 1791, indigenous people scared the hell out of them when a war party of the Northwest Confederacy, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Lenape, destroyed the United States Army. So the first federal Congress passed the Militia Acts in 1792 for authority to go after all enemies, foreign and domestic. So part of that was the Calling Forth Act, which allowed presidents to call up militia to suppress insurrection, but only after a federal judge certified that ordinary law enforcement couldn't handle the situation. Judicial review beforehand was required. Its first use, putting down American resistance, of course. This time, farmers in Pennsylvania resisting an unfair tax on whiskey. The nationalist historians call it the Whiskey Rebellion. It ain't a rebellion. But that was before 1807. Presidents needed a judge to say yes first. See where this is going. After 1807, the president could deploy not just militias, but standing active duty federal troops whenever the president and the president alone decided that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States made it impracticable to enforce the laws. No judge, no certification, just the president making a determination based upon his own discretion. Now, Jefferson had wanted to send troops after Burr immediately in 1806. But James Madison, Jefferson's Secretary of State, told him the existing law didn't allow it. So Jefferson asked Congress to change the law, and they did. So one of the last pillars of the American Revolution was just knocked over. The executive now had unchecked military authority over American citizens. And the Supreme Court gave it its blessing in 1827. A unanimous court made it official in Martin versus Mott, determining whether the exigencies requiring military deployment have arisen is exclusively vested in the president. Translation, as if you need it, courts cannot second-guess the president when he says that insurrection exists. The Chief Justice then wrote that the president's authority must be construed liberally, and it is conclusive, his word, upon all other persons. Conclusive, unreviewable, absolute. Point getting to the interpretations of this now with courts. They would have intended judges to be able to review it. They would have kept the 1790s law intact. They didn't. They removed it. And Jefferson used his new tool within a year. He deployed troops in 1808 against Americans, violating his Embargo Act on Lake Champlain. When New Englanders defied the disastrous embargo, Vermont's militia refused to turn on their neighbors. Jefferson didn't care, so he called out federal troops. And the precedent was set. The president decides what constitutes resistance to federal authority, and the president decides when to send in the military. And now we have 218 years of deployment evidence. Since 1807, presidents have invoked the Insurrection Act over 30 times. Against Native Americans, Jackson, Van Buren, Pierce, Grant, they all used it to crush indigenous resistance and land theft. Against labor movements, Hayes deployed troops against railroad workers in 1877. Cleveland used it against Pullman strikers in 1894. Harding against coal miners in 1921. And Truman against railroad workers in 1946. every major labor resistance met federal troops justified by the Insurrection Act. And against black Americans, repeatedly, this is a through line in American history. Federal troops occupied the South during Reconstruction under the Act's authority, right? But after 1877, it was turned against black communities themselves, deployed to restore order after white mobs attacked black neighborhoods, with the troops inevitably siding with, you guessed it, the white mobs. But briefly, for civil rights. Under the radical Republicans in the 1870s, it was used to suppress the Ku Klux Klan then. But then a big gap until Eisenhower used it to send troops to Little Rock in 1957. JFK used it at Ole Miss in 1962 and Alabama in 1963. LBJ deployed it to protect the Selma marchers in 1965. So for a brief moment, the tool was turned against white supremacists rather than in service of them. And then against other black uprisings more recently. LBJ sent troops to Detroit in 1967. Bush Sr. deployed them to Los Angeles after the Rodney King verdict in 1992. I was in college in LA at the time. And then it returned to its traditional role, protecting white property and order from black rage and injustice. Each use normalized the next. Each deployment made military occupation of American communities seem more routine, more acceptable, tougher to oppose, much less question. But notice what's missing in all that. Any requirement for congressional approval, any judicial review, any time limit, any geographic restriction. The president issues a proclamation ordering insurgents to disperse. If they don't comply immediately, the president can deploy the entire U.S. military domestically for as long as the president wants, wherever the president wants. And according to the Insurrection Act, courts can't review whether insurrection actually exists. Congress cannot override the deployment without veto-proof majorities. And the military, of course, has to follow orders. It's unlimited executive power. Now, for the last 30 years or so, the act's been pretty quiet. Then came the murder of George Floyd. There were calls then for Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act. But then his defense secretary, we used to have a Department of Defense, you know, and the Joint Chiefs chair talked him out of it, barely. On January 6, 2021, Trump wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act to stop Congress from certifying Biden's victory. Only the threat of mass resignation from military leadership prevented it. Now, the opposition from within is gone now. Steve Bannon is no dummy. The whole executive is now a regime, a coalition of far-right nationalists complete with a ruling ideology and a plan for transforming all of American governance. And, what we didn't see coming, aided by a powerful cohort of liberal nationalists. And frankly, a lot of folks who talk to me are surprised that Trump's been waiting this long. He and his cadre has been more patient than a lot of them expected. And courts can't stop it. Sure, federal judges keep issuing rulings, they block policies, they enjoin actions, they declare things unconstitutional, but they have no enforcement mechanism. The Insurrection Act was specifically designed to bypass them. Once Trump invokes it and declares insurrection exists, court rulings just become pieces of paper. Why? Because who enforces them? The executive branch, specifically federal law enforcement and the military. And this regime just bobs and weaves with court decisions. The judges know this. You can see it in their increasingly desperate opinions, their pleas to higher courts, their warnings about the collapse of judicial review. But the Insurrection Act doesn't care about their desperation because it was built to override them. Now, to be fair, if I have to be fair, the writers of the Insurrection Act probably assumed the military would follow the president's orders, but they also assumed some basic commitment to, the Constitution. It assumes presidents wouldn't simply declare their political opposition to be insurgents. Although it did happen once or twice in American history. Meet John Adams. Hold on. I wonder if we should reframe that. I think it assumes the presidents wouldn't use the Insurrection Act against white people like them. Go get your pearls now, because it's clutching season. As the reality of all those assumptions are getting resolved in ways no one saw coming, except for every black American for whom it's a day ending in a Y. The act gives the president the authority. The Supreme Court has reaffirmed that his determination is unreviewable both in the 1830s and with Trump versus the United States. Do you think there's any accountability there? And there's a leadership now that's been selected for its absolute loyalty. And for those of you thinking about the Posse Comitatus Act from the 1870s, one of those great legislative visions created to stop federal troops from being sent against the Ku Klux Klan, When invoked, the Insurrection Act essentially turns it off.